Hi, can you hear me?
Ma'am, I think you're not audible.
Oh, is this better? Can you hear me now? Can you hear? Can you hear me now? I've unmuted myself.
Can you speak now, ma'am?
I'm speaking now.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Krishnam Vande Jagadguru. Suprabhatam Sarvebhyaha. Very good morning to all. Today we have fourth day orientation session. At, the, at first, I wish to welcome all of you. Today we have Dr. Tarinee Awasthee, Assistant Professor, Humanities and Languages, Plain University, Pune, as a guest speaker. I welcome you, ma'am. A heartfelt welcome to Dr. Srinivas sir, Head of the Department of Philosophy. And I also welcome Vishnu sir and Nino ma'am, PhD scholars. And I welcome all the PG students. And also I wish to welcome all the um, interested who joined online. About the session, of traditional Sanskrit disciplines, Mimamsa is the most directly concerned with establishing the validity of and interpreting the Veda. In their attempt to read each statement in the Veda in an unambiguous way, Mimamsakas came up with complex principles of sentimental analysis and theories pertaining to language in general and Vedic language in particular. Mimamsa was hugely influential in Sanskrit intellectual culture all the way to the 18th century for a variety of reasons, including its interaction with other disciplines like Nyāya, its relationship Vedānta, also called Uttara-Mīmāṃsā, and the employment of Mimamsa principles to read other things than the Veda. In this talk, we will touch upon some of the fundamental principles of Mimamsa and a brief survey of its history. Today, we have Dr. Tarinee Awasthi. She is a historian of Samskrita and adjacent intellectual cultures with a particular focus on Mimamsa and Vedanta between 16th and 20th centuries. She is also interested in Rama narratives and questions around religious experience. Now, directly we start the session. Ma'am, I request you to address the session.
Thank you so much. Can I share my screen? Yes, good. I have one other request. Is there any way for me to for the camera to face the audience so I can see the people? Thank you. Really appreciate it. Let me one sec. Hi. You can see this, right? Yes. Okay, let me see if I can get the slideshow started. Okay. Good. Is this visible? Okay, good. Thank you. So I'm going to assume, because I was told that this is a completely introductory session, I'm going to assume not a lot of background knowledge. So I'm going to, if you feel at any point that I'm being too obvious, please stop me and we can move on, right? So the first question I suppose is why talk about Mimamsa? Because when we read textbooks on Indian philosophy, Mimamsa seems to be really the driest, right? It's it's about the pramanas in Mimamsa aren't that interesting, and the epistemology seems, I mean, it's interesting, but only in interaction with Buddhists or with Nyāya. Why should we care about Mimamsa? And the reason we should care about Mimamsa is that what we normally talk about Mimamsa is really a tiny, tiny part of what Mimamsa really is, right? So, what is Mimamsa really concerned with? Like, I don't think I caught your name, but ma'am read out at the beginning, Mimamsa is about analyzing Vedic sentences. It's really about figuring out, theoretically, Mimamsa is about how do we find how do we read Vedic sentences such that our sacrifices, our sacrificial offerings are performed perfectly so that they can lead to heaven, right? That's the basic point of Mimamsa. But the interesting thing about Mimamsa is that it does two things in trying to achieve this. The first thing it has to do is it has to establish why we should care about the Veda in the first place. If you're going to write and comment on a 12-chapter text about how to interpret the Veda, you've got to convince people that the Veda matters in the first place, right? So that's one thing. The other thing Mimamsa does is, as again has already been said, it develops these complicated strategies for analyzing sentences, right? That's why Mimamsa is often identified as Vakya Shastra. So Mimamsakas will sometimes, you will see, they're called Vakya Vids, those who know sentences or statements. In that classical term that is used to refer to somebody who's really an expert in all Sanskrit disciplines, we call them Padavakya Pramanajna, right? Somebody who knows padas, that is grammar, Vakya, that is Mimamsa, and Pramana, that is Nyāya. Right? So Mimamsa is Vakya Shastra. Now, what else do I want to say by way of preliminaries? Yeah, the other reason why, I mean, one of the reasons why Mimamsa was read extensively in the later period, and apart from the fact that it was in close interaction with Nyaya in terms of epistemology, is that Vedanta is really Uttara-Mīmāṃsā, right? So what Mimamsa does for the ritual sections of the Veda, Uttara-Mīmāṃsā does for the Upanishad. We see this when we actually, in Vedanta as well, if you move past the Chatursutri, or if you move past 1-1, or really after the Chatursutri, most of the Brahma Sutras are about analyzing particular portions in the Upanishad and seeing how to read them properly, right? Similarly, in Mimamsa, when there is trying to establish the validity of the Veda, obviously they get into epistemology and they're in close engagement with Buddhists and Naiyayikas. But most of the rest of Mimamsa, which is at least until a couple decades ago, which was really quite ignored in Anglophone academia, is about sentences. It's about coming up with strategies to read, right? To that extent, Larry McRae has demonstrated that it's also connected closely with certain strands within the aesthetic tradition. It's connected, of course, with Nyāya of different kinds, and very often people will say something like Vyavahare Bhattanaya or Vyavahare Gurunaya, which is to say, whatever our metaphysics might be, in usage, in the way we understand language, we just accept in toto either what the Bhattas or the Prabhakaras say, right? Now, I'm going to give you a general outline of some of the principles that Mimamsa comes up with in order to establish the validity of the Veda. At any point, please feel free to stop me for questions, but of course we can do questions later as well. Now, we start with, we should Athato Dharma Jinyasa. Now it begins the inquiry into Dharma, right? What is Dharma? Chodana Lakshano Artho Dharma. Dharma is that which is characterized or understood through commands, and it is that which leads to something desirable, or that which is something desirable. It's Chodana Lakshana, it's Artha. We have to come up with a way to say that only the Veda is a means to understand Dharma, and we have to say that Veda is a means to accurately understand Dharma, right? That's what Mimamsakas are trying to do at the beginning of the Mimamsa Sutra. I'll get into details of text later. I just want to get some of these principles out there. How do you do this? So, for the first question, only the Veda is a means to know Dharma. How do you get to that? Normally, Mimamsa accepts 5, sometimes 6 pramanas, right? Pratyaksha, perception. sense perception, Indriyartha Sannikarsha, you have a sense faculty, it comes in contact with an object, it produces a cognition, right? Anumana, we usually translate it as inference. I'm using it as shorthand. Um, Inference just means simple, right? Smoke on the mountain, you infer there's a fire. Shabda, which we'll come back to. Arthapati is a necessary postulation. People have other definitions for it. Malcolm Keating and Fresky recently did an edited volume on Arthapati that you can look at if you're interested. Arthapati is basically, the classical example is Devadatta does not eat during the day. Devadatta gains weight. So Devadatta must be eating at night, right? You have these two bits of information and you need something to make them work. And then we have upamana, which is sometimes called simile. It's basically a pramana that's based on comparison. If you'll excuse me for a second, I'm going to turn the window because there's a lot of background noise. Just give me one sec. Sorry about that. So upamana is, you see in your life an animal called go, a cow, and somebody tells you, there's like an animal just like this that you can find in the forest, and that's called a gavaya. You go into the forest, you see an animal that looks a lot like a cow, but not quite, and you're in the forest. So you assume this must be a gavaya, right? I have no idea what a gavaya looks like, but this is all I know about it, really, right? So, and there's anupalabdhi or non-grasping, which is a complicated question that we can avoid for the moment. So, the thing with all the other pramanas, except Shabda, is that they have to be grounded in perception, right? For inference, you need to actually perceive smoke. For Arthapati, you need to see Devadatta not eating during the day and you need to see him gaining weight. For Upamana, you need to see a cow and then you need to see a gava, and that's the only way these pramanas work, right? The thing with Pratyaksha is that Pratyaksha can pertain to a present thing and it can pertain to a past thing. You can't have a Pratyaksha of a future thing, right? And dharma pertains to heaven, which is future. There is nobody that you can talk to that has perceived heaven or perceived how sacrifice leads to heaven, and they can tell you. They can't tell you that. You can't. So now we need something that that somehow exists independently of perception, and that is Shruti, Veda. Now, Veda has to be eternal. It doesn't work if the Veda is not eternal, because otherwise Veda would also come after certain things. Veda is eternal. Veda is also authorless. I'll come to authorlessness in a second. Actually, I'll come to authorlessness now. And now the other question is, we need to establish that. So we've established that only the Veda can be a means to understand dharma. And a big motivation in establishing this is, of course, also that the Buddhists are around and they have their own version of dhamma, right? And the Mimamsakas need to say that, well, that doesn't count. Right? Why doesn't that count? Because that comes from a human person. Now, the Mimamsakas, especially Kumarila onwards, are very untrusting people. Kumarila actually says this is, I think, on the Chodhana Sutra in the Shloka Vartika. Kumarila says, men are mostly liars. Men have always mostly been liars. We do not trust human beings, right? Because one, human beings have faults in them. Two, human beings can just, they just lie all the time. So what do? We need a text that doesn't have a human author. Because if there is a fault in speech or in text, it's traceable to the speaker, right? If I say that if you take a right from my house, you will be going westward, and I have no idea if that's true. If that is not the case, it's because I was lacking in knowledge, right? Or if I say that this wall is yellow, or maybe I'm jaundiced, and so the white appears yellow to me. Things like that. The fault can be in me. But if the Veda doesn't have an author, then any fault that might accrue from the author doesn't apply to the Veda. So the Veda is eternal and the Veda is perfect. Like, there can be nothing wrong with the Veda because there's no author to get anything wrong, right? So far, so good? Yes.
Aren't Vedas scriptures written by people? So
for the Mimamsaka, God, no. I mean, I'm speaking as the Mimamsaka would say it. I obviously think that the Vedas are authored, but no, Mimamsa doesn't accept either human or divine authorship for the Veda, and they have a whether you believe it or not, they have a long extended argument for it, which is that if they were authored, wouldn't we have remembered? It's a long argument. But for Mimamsa, no, the Veda is not authored. Vedanta is more complicated in that, uh, again, one, of course, Vedanta has different perspectives in different kinds of Vedanta, but generally, or at least in some Vedantas, they accept that the Veda is unauthored, but they also accept that it can be transmitted via Ishvara. But yes, so does that at all answer your question?
I mean, I get that intuitively you could get the information of the Vedas that, the rishis of the yesterday might have gotten through intuitive, like meditative, like state.
No. Mimamsa does not buy that. So
okay.
Mimamsa says, and that's also important because you need to reject Buddhist scripture, right? You need to reject. I mean, that's not the only reason. There are other reasons, but one of the reasons you need to reject. So even the idea of a special kind of cognition that some people can have access to, that they can intuit or they can meditate, none of that is acceptable to a Mimamsaka. Why? Because one, you have to trust a person, and we don't like people, right? I mean, I'm just saying, Kumarila does. I don't think Kumarila liked people very much. And the other is that you don't trust any kind of cognition that you can't have, right? So for Mimamsakas, it's not like there was when I say the Veda is eternal, I mean it. Or when the Mimamsaka says the Veda was eternal, the Mimamsaka means it. The Mimamsaka is saying that the world always existed exactly as it does now, and not from the beginning of time, but forever, there have been Trivarnikas, twice born men, transmitting the Veda in exactly the same way. There's no beginning to this cycle. There was never the Veda is like it's part of the natural world. Right? It's like the mountains. It's always just there. Yes.
Okay.
I thought you had another
Isn't
question.
that? I do. I have many
Tell
questions
me.
regarding authors. As far as the okay, when you say the eternal, the information in Vedas are eternal, obviously, and not the physical scriptures which are right.
Again, for Mimamsa, again, not the written, but the orally transmitted text of the Veda is eternal, literally.
Right. And it has been and if the world has existed forever in the same state, isn't that infinite regress? There's no cause for anything.
They don't need, it's always there. Why is that infinite regress? It's not a
Because
causal chain.
shouldn't there be a causal chain for anything that exists? Isn't there like a cause and effect chain that always
Well,
that you
but that applies if something is coming into being. The Veda is not coming into being. It's just there. See, that's the thing that you need to wrap your head around. Remember also that the Mimamsakas don't have the archaeological evidence we have to be able to establish that the world came into being at a certain point. They don't have all of that, right? So it's actually a less crazy notion in the first millennium than it is now, right?
okay.
It's not that the Veda came into being or the world came into being. No. It's always just there.
Okay.
Right? And that's, you need to wrap your head around that a little bit in order to be able to make sense of a lot of the other things that the Mimamsakas care about. And we're going to come to one of the more fun ones. But is that any other questions at this stage?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
You have told that pratyaksha is pertinent to present thing and past thing, but not a future thing.
Not to Mimamsakas, yes.
I'm just curious because according to Vatsayana in Nyāya Sutra, he says Sat Vishayam cha Pratyaksham. Pratyaksha is only pertinent to the present thing, not the past or neither the future.
Well, I'm sorry. I meant that Pratyaksha can apply to a present thing, and you can have had a Pratyaksha in a previous moment of a past thing. That's what I meant. Sorry. Thanks. I'm glad for the opportunity to clarify. Other questions? Good. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on now, but we can come back to any of this at any point. Now we have this eternal, authorless, orally transmitted material. There's a problem with this material. The problem with this material is that it is full of factual or narrative statements, right? Why is that a problem? If the Veda is eternal, so if I say right now that it rained yesterday, this statement has to be made after it rained, right? there can't be an eternal statement that it rained yesterday. That's impossible. But the Vedas full of statements like Vayu is the fastest god, Rudra cried. What do you do with these things? So, and the problem is this is a big part of the Vedas. So the Mimamsakas have to come up with some way to make something of it. Now, going back, we were talking about how Dharma is Chodana Lakshana, right? Dharma is understood through command. So we need, or injunction. I'm going to use command and I will use injunction more, and we can talk about why. But everything in the Veda is oriented towards telling you what to do so that you can get to heaven, or so that you can get cattle, or so that you can have more children, whatever, progeny. Usually sons. Now, so because everything is oriented towards that, the problem with factual statement is that because this is a sutra, because the Veda is oriented towards action, amnayasya kriyarthatvat, there is the meaninglessness of those which are not about action, and therefore there is non-eternality of the Veda, right? So if the Veda is saying Vayu is a super fast god, it doesn't have anything to do with action. It's just like a random statement about Vayu, and it must be coming after Vayu, after the god Vayu has existed. And it's an even greater problem for something like So Rodi Rudrasya Rudratvam. He cried, and that is why Rudra is called Rudra. If you have something like that, that has to happen. That statement has to be made after Rudra has already cried. And again, we can't have that. One, because it has nothing to do with any kinds of action, and two, it makes the Veda non-eternal. So the Mimamsakas come up with what I think is one of the most interesting concepts in Mimamsa, Arthavada. Essentially, they say that these statements in the Veda have no fact value. It's not that they're true or false. It is that they just aren't about things. They're not meant to convey any factual information to you. So then why does the Veda have this big bunch of pointless statements? And I mean, basically you're rejecting most of the Veda, right? As pointless. The Mimamsakas say that they're connected with vidhi, they're connected with an injunction, and that's why they make sense, and that's why they're useful. So, for example, the statement Vayu is the fastest god comes just after one should sacrifice a white animal for Vayu, right? So that means that what you're being told, what you're meant to understand from these two sentences together is that you should sacrifice this white animal to Vayu because Vayu is the fastest god, and that doesn't really mean Vayu is the fastest god, because also the Mimamsakas say, ha ha ha, how stupid are you to believe that there are gods? I'm going to be a little facetious from time to time. I don't mean any of this, right? I'm just exaggerating for effect. But the Mimamsakas don't care about gods. They think it's ridiculous to believe in gods with form that come and take your offering when you sacrifice. They say, no, what you meant to understand is that the sacrifice to Vayu gets you results really fast, right? That's just the Mimamsaka position. I'm not endorsing this position. I'm not, no offense is meant. I'm just saying that's how the Mimamsakas see it, right? So what this does, and again, with the Rudra example, Rudra cried, that's why Rudra is called Rudra. They say they have this complicated thing about you shouldn't give silver in charity because silver is the tears of Rudra, things like that. Right? The point being that most of the factual statements in the Veda are explained in this way. And Kumarila, whom we'll talk about in a second, extends this argument to Itihasa and Purana as well. So Kumarila actually says in the Mahabharata, in the context of the Mahabharata, that don't pay too much. This is in the Arthavada Adhikarana in 1-2 of the Mimamsa Sutras. He says, don't worry too much about the fact value of about all the events in the Mahabharata and so on. They don't matter so much. Now, just to give you a sense of how this principle plays out in other traditions or in adjacent traditions, Shankara takes an interesting position, because Shankara has to establish that we can take Upanishadic statements seriously as pramana, but of course Upanishadic statements are mostly factual, right? Brahman is like this. right? Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. What do you do? So Shankara says that there's an important difference between Mimamsa and Karmakanda on the one hand, and Vedanta and Upanishad on the other hand, Uttara-Mīmāṃsā or Sharirak-Mīmāṃsā and Upanishad on the other hand, which is that Mimamsa is about something to be brought into being, right? We said it's about something future, whereas Vedanta is about something that's eternally existent. So for Shankara, it's okay to accept the principle of Arthavada insofar as Karmakanda is concerned. But when we come to the Upanishad, we don't operate in the same way, right? Ramanuja goes one step further and he actually says that, in fact, even in Karmakanda, if there is a statement that is not contradicted by perception, we can accept whatever factual seeming thing the Veda says. So if it says, I'm just giving an example, is not necessarily real. If it says that Indra's got a thunderbolt and you don't have any reason to believe Indra doesn't have a thunderbolt, you can go ahead and believe it, right? But within Mimamsa, anything that seems factual has no fact value, right? You don't treat it as a factual statement. You just treat it as somehow connected with Vidhi, usually something that is in praise of Vidhi, right? It's prarochanartha. It's for the purpose of praise. So Vayurvai Kripishta Devata, Vayu is the fastest god, tells you that one should sacrifice to Vayu because Vayu is really because Vayu, that sacrifice to Vayu will bring you results real fast. Is that okay? Good so far? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Right, so that's one interesting thing. Now, the other kind of problem has to deal with smritis, right? So Mimamsakas want two things. They need smriti, well, they want really three things. They need to establish that only things without authors are sources of valid knowledge. They still need the Dharma Shastras, which they like and which have been composed by other people like them, to count as pramana. And they want Buddhist scripture to definitely not be pramana, right? So in order to figure that, to achieve all of these things, again, the problem is raised. This is in Mimamsa 1.3. Because, Dharma is grounded in Shruti, and that which is not, that which is not Veda is useless. It's you can't depend on that, right? And the answer is, well, the same kind of people that transmit the Veda also observe what's written in the Smritis, right? So the idea is that when we see a Dharma Shastra that is basically, it's really the principle of people like us, right? If people like us are saying that this is Dharma, then you infer that there must be a Shruti source for it, right? Which is also why you will see very often in Mimamsa and in Vedanta, the terms Pratyaksha and Anumana used for Shruti and Smriti respectively, right? So Shruti is Pratyaksha in that it's part of the directly transmitted Veda, and Smriti is Anumana in the sense that you have to infer that it has a Vedic basis, right? Now, once you let Smriti in, all kinds of things can be done. So there's a bit of a shift between Shrabar and Kumarila, which we can talk about. But basically, once you allowed Smriti in, you have people like Yamuna, for example, around the 9th, 10th century, who was traditionally believed to be Ramanuja's teacher's teacher, and who wrote, by the way, what I think is one of the most beautiful stotras in Sanskrit ever, which is called the Stotra Ratna. It's, anyway, we can talk about the Stotra Ratna if you like. But Yamuna, in his Agama Pramanya, uses basically Mimamsa principles, primarily the same set of principles around Smriti, to say that Vaishnava Agamas also count as Pramana, because he says, well, we're also Shishta Traivarnikas, we're also, well-educated, wise-born men, and why should our Agamas not count, right? So, and once that door has been opened over the second millennium, Venkatrishnan has written about this extensively, over the second millennium, all Puranas, and then you begin, of course, to be included as Puranas, of course, are Smriti classically as well, but there comes to be this strange situation where you're both according fact value to Puranas, but you're also acknowledging them as Smriti, and you're using principles that are drawn from Mimamsa, but you're transforming them to the point that by the 14th, 15th, 16th century, we have people who are saying, well, Bhagavata Purana is actually superior to the Veda, right? It's an even better Pramana than Shruti is. But anyway, I'm just saying these are the worlds that the Mimamsakas contributed to creating that they would themselves have hated, right? Good so far? Does how Smriti work make sense? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions at this stage? We can move on? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, now I'm just going to talk about some concepts in Mimamsa that are important to how we understand Vedic statements. And one of those concepts is the idea of bhavana. So let's take the sentence, Swarga Kamo Yajeta, right? One who desires heaven should sacrifice. That's it's the standard example statement because it's simple, it's got the very basics of how Mimamsa works and how you're meant to read a Vedic statement. The Mimamsaka wants to say that we should read now Yajeta is got what we call in Sanskrit the ling or the optative ending, which means one should do something. One ought to do something. Now, when you say Swarga Kamo Yajeta, one who desires heaven should sacrifice, the way the Mimamsaka analyzes it, and later it's sometimes been called the Vivarana, the analysis, the drawing out of the sentence. How does it go? One should bring about heaven through sacrifice. Shabara says that in the statement, one who desires heaven should sacrifice, we have a thing that needs to be brought about or achieved, and that is heaven. Right? And we have something that we are being told to do, that is sacrifice. Now, sacrifice, if you're doing it, you need some purpose for which to do it. And heaven, if it is to be produced or achieved or brought into being, needs some kind of a means to achieve it. Right? So he says it's like the principle of somebody whose horses have died and another person whose chariot is broken, which is to say, if you're both going, so what you do is you take the chariot of the other guy whose horses have died, and you take the horses of the guy whose chariot is broken, and you put them together, right? So Swarga needs some means by which to produce it, and Yaga needs something to produce. So you put them together and you say one should produce heaven through sacrifice, right? And this, what I'm saying, produce, the real word is bring into being. So one should bring into being heaven through sacrifice. Now there are typically, so this is called bhavana, the bringing into being. Bringing into being typically has three components. Bhavya, the thing to be brought into being, which is in this case Swarga. Karana, which is the means, in this case Yaga. And the itikartavita really means thus to be doneness, which means this is how you do things, which is to say the procedure, right? How do you go about bringing into being sacrifice? Now, heaven. Now, obviously, there can be sentences where something else is the means and sacrifice is the thing to be produced. That is fine. But in a single sentence, you cannot have more than one bhavya. Otherwise, this leads to something Mimamsakas absolutely hate, which is called Vakya Bheda. A single sentence cannot enjoin two things, okay? And also, in the same sentence, and I'll explain this in a second, two or more things, or even one thing cannot have more than one status. What does that mean? So let's say we have the sentence, Vajpayena, and I'll translate it, and as always, feel free to stop me. Vajpayena Swarajya Kamo Yajeta. Right? One who desires Swarajya, sovereignty, should sacrifice with the Vajpaya. Now now if we think that Vajpaya is a substance that you use in the sacrifice, right? Which it could well be, it could be a kind of drink, right? Like it could be a gruel of some kind. So then there is a problem because the sentence has to tell you two things. You should sacrifice with this substance called Vajpaya, and you should produce Swarajya through the sacrifice, right? And Mimamsakas don't like for there to be two things stated in the sentence. So this leads to what is called a sentential split. I forgot to put that on the slide. It's called sentential split or Vakya Bheda. It's sometimes explained in terms of when you have to repeat a word, a part of word, or a cluster of words in order to make a sentence work. So, for example, in this sentence, you would have to say, one should sacrifice with the Vajapaya, one should produce heaven with this through the sacrifice, right? So, Vajapaya and sacrifice both have to be repeated, right? And they're both in different statuses. So, in one part, one should sacrifice with the Vajapaya. Vajapaya, yeah, the sacrifice is the thing to be produced. And when you say through sacrifice bring about Swarajya, then sacrifice becomes the means. And this is all happening in the same sentence. This is a problem partly because if you're going to repeat a part of the sentence in order to make it work, so if I'm saying Vajapaya twice, only one of those Vajapayas is actually Shrauta. Only one of those Vajapayas is actually coming from the Veda, right? And the other is basically I've made it up. And if I've just made it up, then it can't have pramanya, right? So we don't like for sentences to be split. And therefore, everything in Mimamsa, or is in every sentence, things are oriented towards a single bhavya, right? In the same way as everything in the sacrifice is oriented towards, so all the subordinate elements of the sacrifice, which is sometimes called guna, they're all oriented towards the achievement of the sacrifice, which leads to what is called the apurva. Now, this is another thing that this is not a word that is there in Shruti. I mean, this is not an idea. I'm sorry, that is not there. That is there in Shruti. What does it mean? You perform a sacrifice now, right? And you're being told at some point you will get heaven. You pointed out, right? There needs to be a causal chain. But there is a gap, there's a time gap. So what do you do? So they say what a sacrifice does is that it produces an apurva, which sort of accumulates and eventually it leads to heaven, and there can be more or less heaven and so on and so forth. The idea is like that. But basically, everything, again, Mekra has written about this in the hierarchical organization article. By the way, these further readings are not comprehensive at all. Nor are these, don't take these slides too seriously. I've just put some words on there so that I don't have to write, because I can't write them out, and so that they're in your head. And these are just suggestions. They're not comprehensive further reading lists. If you want something on something in particular, please email me and I can let you know, right? But yeah, so we have Vakya Bhed, and the other thing is what we call Viruddha Trika, the contrary triads. So I said the same thing should not have two statuses in a sentence, right? What are these statuses? One idea in Mimamsa is of Upadeya and Uddeshya, that which is to be taken up and that which is referred to. What does it mean? Let's say we are told, I'm probably going to get the Vedic statement wrong, but for the purpose of the example, one who desires heaven should sacrifice with the Agnihotra, right? Or one should sacrifice with the Agnihotra, for example, right? Or whatever sacrifice. And then if the next sentence is one should sacrifice with yogurt, right? So when you analyze the first sentence, it means one should produce heaven or whatever it is one is being told to produce by means of sacrifice, right? The new information there is the sacrifice, because now this is another thing, the phala of a sacrifice can never be enjoined. You can't be enjoined to want something. The phala is there. The phala can never be a thing to be taken up. The phala is just there. The phala is always uddeshya. So if you be told one should produce X through sacrifice, in that sentence, sacrifice is the thing to be taken up, and it's also the new information, or it is the subordinate thing. Right? Bear in mind, upadeya, it is to be taken up. It is enjoined. It's new information. It's vidheya, and it is guna. It is subordinate to the phala. Right? Good so far? The structure makes sense? It's always easier with a board, but... And then in the next sentence, if it says, you should sacrifice with yogurt. In that sentence, you're being told, bring about sacrifice through yogurt. In this sentence, the sacrifice is no longer the new information. You already know that you have to sacrifice in the previous sentence. So now this becomes the thing which is being referred to it becomes a thing which is reiterated. It's no longer new information, right? So it's anudya, it's anuvada, right? And it's also the primary thing, right? So the old information, which is only referred to, is a thing that you're trying to achieve, which you already know from elsewhere or from another sentence, or you know that you should already want, right? So is that somewhat clear? Should I go over it again?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Can
Yes,
you
it's
repeat?
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say you have a sentence. Bring about one who desires heaven should sacrifice, right? We talked earlier about how we should analyze it as one should produce heaven through sacrifice, right? In this sentence, you can't the heaven part of the sentence cannot be an injunction. You can't be told to want heaven, right? That's always a given, right? What is new in this sentence, what is to be done, what you're being told to take up, what is the new information, what is the enjoined part, and what is the subordinate part is heaven, is sacrifice. Why is sacrifice subordinate? Because you're only doing the sacrifice in order to produce heaven, right? So that is one kind of status that any word in a sentence can have. Good so far? Make sense?
Okay.
Now let's say the immediately next sentence is one should sacrifice with curds or yogurt or whatever. I think it's curds. One should sacrifice with yogurt. In this sentence, sacrifice takes the same position as heaven had in the last sentence, right? So you would analyze this sentence as one should produce sacrifice with yogurt, right? Good so far? Now, in this part, sacrifice is no longer the thing you're being told to take up. You already know that. So, sacrifice is being merely referred to. Sacrifice is not the new information, it is the reiteration from the last sentence. It's anuvada. And sacrifice is the primary thing. In the previous sentence, when you were bringing about heaven through sacrifice, sacrifice was a subordinate thing. When you're bringing about sacrifice through yogurt, sacrifice becomes the primary thing, right? That structure makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what happens in Vakya Bheda, one of the things that happens in Vakya Bheda is that you need the same. So back to the Vajpayee example, one who desires Swarajya should sacrifice with Vajpayee, right? So if you're being told one should produce Swarajya through sacrifice and one should produce sacrifice through Vajpayee, if you're being told both of those things in the same sentence, sacrifice comes to have different statuses in the same sentence. And both of those statuses can't be pramana because they can't both be shrauta, they can't both be Vedic, right? And so you need to find a way to make it work such that you're not being enjoined two things with one thing having two different statuses, right? The way they get out of the problem in this particular example is they say Vajpayee is actually the name of a sacrifice. So then Vajpayee and Yaga become what we call co-referential, right? The Sanskrit term is Samanadhikarana, which means that Vajpayee and Yaga are not actually referring to another thing. So what's being said is through the Vajpayee Yaga, produce Swarajya. Good so far?
Yeah.
Questions, comments?
Why are they so particular about this?
Well, they're particular about this because, like I said, the principle is that if you have to reiterate something, both of those things cannot be Vedic. Let's say if the sentence is one should sacrifice with the Vajpayee, there's only one occurrence of sacrifice and there's only one occurrence of Vajpayee. If I reread it, then I'm basically making stuff up. And if I'm allowed to make stuff up, then we would be no better than the Buddhists. I'm saying that's what the Mimamsaka would say. Okay.
Okay.
Does that
so
help? Yeah, tell me.
Here, what I'm trying to get is at different points in Vedic scripture, they must have mentioned that you have to sacrifice with yogurt, and at separate point, they must have mentioned that through sacrifice you achieve heaven.
Right.
So if you put them both, even though they have different statuses, if you put them both in a sentence, isn't that still like Shruti? Because they both are there in the
It's perfectly fine if there are two different sentences. That's what I'm saying. This is only a problem if you're doing it in the same sentence.
Yeah, I meant in the same sentence, even if it's in the same sentence.
So now, okay, one of the things with Mimamsa is that if the Veda says something, they have to find a way to make it work, right?
Okay.
The other thing about I mean, I don't mean this trivially. I'll get to it in a second, right?
Okay.
There are a couple. I said at the beginning that what Mimamsakas are trying to do is trying to come up with a way to interpret the Veda. And theoretically, I said it's so that we know how to perform sacrifices, right? That theoretically was almost the operational part of that sentence, because in the world of Mimamsa, nobody is actually confused about how to do their Agnihotra. Right?
Okay.
Everybody knows how to do their Agnihotra. They learned it from their teachers or from their dad. Right? This is not a problem. What Mimamsakas are trying to do is to come up with and this is why it's a challenge and it's why it's fun, because they're trying to come up with a principled way to read the Veda the way they want to read it. Right? They're trying to evolve a set of principles to say that we are not arbitrarily reading the Veda in this way. This is what it really means. And look, I have this 12-chapter text to tell you how. Right? Now, so if the other thing that the Mimamsaka says, and Shabara actually states this in so many words somewhere in chapter 3, is our job is not to say tell the Veda what it should say. Our job is to interpret the Veda as it's given. Right? So if there is a sentence where in fact more than one thing has been enjoined, you come up with a strategy. And one of those strategies is what is called Vishishta Vidhi or qualified injunction. So the classical example of this, again, Mekre has written about this in the hierarchical organization paper. That's really Mekre's paper and Olit's paper. Those two are, to my mind, if you guys haven't already looked at them, they're two great entry points into Mimamsa. But so there is a statement in the Veda: one should buy Soma with a red 1-year-old pink-eyed cow. Right? Now this is a problem. Well, actually, it doesn't say cow. You should bring about Soma with a red feminine thing that is also 1-year-old and pink-eyed. That's a lot of information. You can't be told to buy Soma with something that is red and also pink-eyed and also 1-year-old. All of those things can't be part of the same sentence because we have that's more than one thing enjoined. We can't have a sentential split, right? So what do? The Mimamsaka says that what you're actually being told is to buy Soma. So the thing that is being produced is the buying of the Soma, right? And that production is to be achieved through a feminine thing, a cow, in which all of these properties inhere, right? So it's a qualified it's an injunction of a qualified thing, right? Obviously, there's a bit of a cheat, but the point of Mimamsa is not so much that they have stringent principles. The point is that they're clever, right? And really, this is what Mimamsakas care about. They care about being clever, especially for after the 8th century. That's almost all Mimamsakas care about. We'll talk about that. But does that clear it up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we're okay for time, right? We're not in a hurry. Shri, we're okay?
No. Yeah, we are okay.
Okay, thank you. Good so far. We can move on. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Now I'm going to sort of step back. We have these principles in place. We know something about how the system works. Now I'm going to step back and do a little bit of a very sketchy overview. Okay. This is not intended to be comprehensive. It's just supposed to get some things out there. So the foundational text of the Mimamsa system is the Mimamsa Sutras of Jaimini, attributed to Jaimini. These are, as like all sutra texts, they presume an older history of the system, and they're really only formulations that come at a later stage in the development of a discipline. Francis Clooney dates the Mimamsa Sutras to about the 2nd century BC. I think we can push this by 2-3 centuries without getting into any trouble, right? It's really we don't really have a hard date for the Mimamsa Sutras. We have Shabara around the 5th century, and between Jaimini and Shabara, we know there were several commentaries. Shabara refers to a few of them. There's this Vrittikara whom actually Shabara quotes from at length in chapter 1. So there is already a commentarial tradition. The only commentary that survives it is Shabara's. Now, there is an important difference on this in terms of how Mimamsa versus Vedanta have developed historically. In Vedanta, the earliest extant commentary that we have is Shankara's, right? There are pre-Shankara commentaries which were very different, whose metaphysics was very different from Shankara's, and both Bhaskara and Yamuna refer to them, and even later, I mean Ramanuja and so on, they also are aware of them and they're able to refer to them, right? And despite the fact that Shankara is the earliest extant commentary, within a generation of Shankara, I mean, Shankara is never universally accepted. Whereas in Mimamsa, although there is awareness of earlier commentaries, nobody fundamentally disputes Shabara, right? People can pick problems at some parts of Shabara. Both Kumaril and Prabhakar do so. Later authors also do it. They say, well, this should have been this way, this should have been this other way. But by and large, everybody accepts Shabara as the first order commentary. And everybody more or less accepts what Shabara thinks is the topical sentence of any given Adhikarana. So, just structurally, the Mimamsa Sutra is 12 books or 12 because there are sub chapters. I'm going to say chapter and book, book and chapter, but you can say chapter and section, whatever you like, right? But the Mimamsa Sutra is 12 chapters or 12 books, each of which has 4 or 8 sub chapters, and within each sub chapter we have what are called adhikaranas, which are sort of, there's a classical definition of adhikarana which I don't want to go into right now, but basically an adhikarana has a problem. It should technically have a Purupaksh. It should tell you what the possible but always mistaken position is, and it should tell you why we are right on this question, right? So 12, where was I going with this? Right. So we have, in in a lot of adhikaranas, and this is true of Vedanta as well, we have what is called a Vishaya Vakya, or a topical sentence, which is to say this is the sentence that this adhikarana is about. This is what we are disputing, this is what we are arguing over. That is accepted, whatever Shabara says on that, by and large, is accepted, right? Sometimes Kumarila, whom we'll talk about in a second, will have some issues with it. We'll say, well, he has done it this way, but he'll sneakily say, you could say that it's better to have done it this other way. Maybe you should have cited this other example, or maybe you should have cited these examples in a different order. But it's okay, and then he'll come up with some kind of a convoluted way for why it works, right? But sometimes it's very clear when Kumarila really thinks Shabar is right and when he's only being polite. And sometimes he even stops being polite. He'll actually say, well, Shabar has got this wrong from time to time. Okay? Shabar, as I've said, it's about 5th century. Shabara is interesting for a variety of reasons. One fascinating thing about Shabara is that in the entire Mimamsa Sutra, in his entire Bhashya on the Mimamsa Sutra, he makes no reference ever to liberation. Shabara was living in a world where there were Buddhists, where there were presumably some kinds of Upanishads. There were people there were Shaivas and Vaishnavas, and there were lots of people who were this is post Mahabharata, for God's sake, right? Everyone cares about liberation. Shabara almost pointedly never even refers to it, right? And it really seems to be deliberate. You can't. It's not possible for it to have never come up. He just refuses to acknowledge it, right? We don't really have a good sense of how innovative Shabara was being or not, just because we don't have the intervening commentaries. But if you look at the epistemology, Shabara had if you read Shabara, it seems, assuming he's not getting all of it from an earlier commentary, he has a great mind. He's an interesting thinker. He's a very interesting writer. So if you look at the history of Sanskrit Shastric writing, we have sort of the first generation of what we think of as Shastric, or we might even call scholastic, but I don't like that word, Sanskrit. And the first generation is really Patanjali, right? Patanjali has a pseudo conversational style, right? There'll be a little bit of a back and forth. Well, if this, then what? And then, oh, all right. So he has a pseudo conversational style. By the time you come to Kumarila, and I'll talk about that in a second, it's perfectly sort of, it's perfectly technical. Every sentence is exactly crafted and so on and so forth. Shabara is a kind of transitional stage, right? So he can sometimes be a little snarky, he can be bantery, he'll sometimes have folk examples. He sometimes, he has like these little ticks. So for example, very often he'll use the future tense when he really means the optative, right? So if he's trying to say, if this were this way, it would happen this other way, he will sometimes say, if this is this way, then this will be this way, right? So I mean, these are little ticks that if you read Sanskrit Shastra broadly, they strike you as distinctive, right? And Shabara has a very distinctive voice. The other interesting thing about Shabara is this Pūrva-Pakshas. If you ever get a chance, and you really should, if you read one of Shabara, where he talks about why sacrifice can't lead to heaven, right? There's a Pūrva-Paksha. It's not his position, it's the opponent's position. But his defense of that, he employs the same amount of snark when he's talking about it. So he'll say, well, you say that one who has the implements of sacrifice goes to heaven, but we see the body burn up right here, right? So who is it that's going to be? So he has a voice, which I find very interesting, which I think people don't acknowledge about Shabar enough. He's interesting, he's fun, right? Next generation, 7th century is when Shabara has already systematized it. Now we begin to get further doctrinal formulations, elaborations, greater engagement with existing philosophical systems, and that really comes with Kumarila and Prabhakara. Kumarila wrote, to our knowledge, 4 works. He wrote the Shloka-Vartika. So 1.1, so chapter 1, subchapter 1 of Mimamsa is what I said at the beginning, that's the quote-unquote philosophical epistemological part, because that's where they're establishing the validity of the Veda. So you have to engage with other systems, you have to talk about different kinds of pramanas except for Shruti, right? And that in Kumarila gets a different commentary, which is called the Shloka-Vartika. It's a completely verse commentary. The term Vartika is interesting because, the other example, the first possibly example, and the only pre-Kumarila example we have of a Vartika is, in the Brahmanical systems, Katyayana's Vartika, right? Which is on grammar. Vartikas are not only supposed to explain what's there, they're also supposed to point out, well, this has been said badly. So if you read Katyayana, sometimes he'll say something like, he has said this, he should also have added this, or he should have said it this way, right? So Vartikas can also correct. And Kumarila's Vartika does that. Then he has a Tantra Vartika, which goes up to 3.8, end of chapter 3. So it starts from 1.2 and goes up to 3.8. And this is mixed prose and verse. And we can talk about how Kumarila uses verses. But Kumarila is he's trying to iron out some problems in the system. He's trying to make it, as it were, more systematic. So for every chapter, Shabara does this too. Not to say he doesn't, but for every chapter he'll have, this is why, for every subchapter, this is why this subchapter fits here. This is why this adhikarana, this section fits here. Why are these the examples and not other ones, right? And he also has his own sort of tangents that he goes on sometimes. He has his own concerns that are not necessarily always there in Shabara, that weren't necessarily concerns for Shabara. And Tantravartika is pretty elaborate, right? Then we have what's called the Tuk Tika. Now, the word Tika, if you think about how commentaries are understood, Tikas are, unlike a Bhashya, which typically will comment on everything, a Tika will sometimes, it'll just maybe pick up on certain things, maybe only talk about the complexities. A Tika is not obligated to be comprehensive. And the Tuk Tika is really not comprehensive, right? So it goes from chapter 4 through 12. And sometimes Kumarila will be almost Tantra Vartika-esque. He'll really get into a question, he'll elaborate it in great detail. And then sometimes he'll just be like, he'll have 2 lines, and sometimes he'll just skip Adhikaranas altogether. He's like, I'm bored, right? That's a Tuk Tika. We have another text called the Brihat Tika, which only survives to us in fragments and verses. And all that survives of it is in verse and is typically what is called quote-unquote philosophical. So it's more people have suggested it's more Shloka-Vartika than Tantra-Vartika. Tuk Tika territory, people have also suggested that maybe it's all verse. In fact, people think it's all verse. Some caution is warranted here because even in mixed prose and verse text, sometimes only the verse survives. Like what is quoted is verses. So if you look at Tantravartika quotation over the centuries, most people will quote the verses even from the Tantravartika, right? Because verses are easy. If you're writing something, it's less likely that you will remember 3 lines or 4 lines or 6 lines of prose than a verse, right? The pithy. So, but we don't really know anything about the Brihat Tika except that it existed and we have some verses by it. Scholars have worked on it. I think Yoshimitsu has something on it. Again, if you are looking for more references, feel free to write to me. And the other big guy is Prabhakara, right? Who wrote the Bruhati and the Lagvi. They're also the quote unquote, well, founder of a school is a bit of it's misleading, but they both stand at the head of two streams in Mimamsa, the Bhatta, which is Kumarila Bhattas, and the Prabhakara, or which is Prabhakara Mishras, or which is also his view is sometimes also called the Guru Mata. The big differences between them are, and this is, and what I'm going to say next, it's a little bit ahistorical, but it's broadly true. Kumarila's vision of how the Veda works and how motivation works is very different from Prabhakara's, right? For Kumarila, we're all rational, self-interested actors. Heaven sounds like a nice thing. It seems like a desirable thing to have. We have this orally transmitted material that tells us how to get heaven. So you just, you put two and two together and you're like, well, if I want heaven, maybe I should do this, right? And you're enjoying to do something because you want heaven, and so you do it, right? And that's how it works. There's no sense of duty involved as such, right? We often say dharma is duty. Well, not really, at least not for Kumarila, and not for much of Dharma Shastra. Dharma is just what you do if you want something, right? For Prabhakara, it's got more to do with how we learn and understand language, right? So for Prabhakara, the way we acquire language is by understanding commands. And he says we are hardwired to obey commands. And because the Veda works as commands, we are just inclined to do what the Veda says, right? So it works a little bit differently. The other difference is in the way they understand how sentences work. For Bhattas, you cognize each individual part of the sentence and then you understand how they tie in together. For Prabhakara, what you comprehend is the sentence as a whole, and you only understand the parts as embedded in the sentence, right? I've put Mandana here. Mandana is really post Kumarila and post Prabhakara, but I've put him. He's very close in time. Generally, people think Prabhakara is a little bit later than Kumarila. Mandana presumably is half a generation later than both of them. Why is Mandana interesting? Mandana is interesting because Kumaril and Prabhakara write commentaries on big parts of Shabara's Bhashya. Mandana does not write any commentaries on Shabara. Mandana writes two independent texts. He does a similar thing with Vedānta. But Mandana writes these independent texts, the Vidhi Viveka and the Bhavana Viveka, which we've talked both about injunction and Bhavana. Elliot Stern has been working on this. Akane Saito, whom I've mentioned here, is working on it, on Mandana. So he wrote these independent texts and he's not really beholden to necessarily defend Shabara's views, right? He's just taken these ideas and he's working through them. And he doesn't have any textual allegiances. Unlike Kumaril and Prabhakara, who even if they're disagreeing with Shabara, are really grounded in Shabara. The other thing that Mandan is able to do, because he's just writing these two prakranas, I'm calling them prakranas, just because he's writing these two texts, independent text, is he doesn't have to talk about things like Arthavada, for example, right? We don't know what Mandana's view on Arthavada is as a Mimamsaka because he doesn't talk about it. Kumaril and Prabhakara are obligated to defend the whole thing as they get it. Mandana just, hey, this looks like a fun idea, let me see where I can take it. Right? Then we have what we can think of as middle period Mimamsa. We have Shalikanatha, who is a Prabhakara, and who's really the systematizer of Prabhakara Mimamsa. Much of what we have of Prabhakara is via Shalikanatha, or at least a lot. We have Umveka, who is, I missed out some of his work. But Umveka is a Bhatta. He comments on the Shloka Vartika of Kumarila. He also writes a commentary on the Bhavana Viveka of Mandana. So he's obviously post Mandana. We don't really know very much about him. He seems to be a fairly cutting edge Mimamsaka. He also, interestingly, in the opening to his Shloka Vartika commentary, quotes from Bhavabhuti's Malati Madhav. There's this great verse in the Malati Madhav, which you guys, I'm sure, know, which goes, those who have disregard for this work, this effort was not made for them. Someday, somebody who is of the same dharma, of the same nature as me, will emerge. Time is limitless and the earth is wide, right? We know this verse from Bhavabhuti, but I mean, Bhavabhuti has it in the Malati Madhav, but Umveka presumably quotes it. Some people used to think at some point that Bhavabhuti and Umveka are the same person. I don't think anyone thinks that anymore. But so we have Umveka. We have Sucharita, who wrote a commentary on, again, the Shloka Vartika of Kumarila. We have Parthasarathi. Parthasarathi is interesting because you must have observed that people who are commenting on Kumarila are commenting on the Shloka Vartika. Parthasarathi is really the person who, again, is thinking about the system as a whole, right? He's really the next extant Bhatta after Kumarila who's thinking about the system as a whole. So we'll talk about what happens in the later period. But when people need to reach for things in the 5th chapter, in the 10th chapter, where do you go? You go to Parthasarathi, right? So Parthasarathi wrote a few commentaries and he wrote some independent works. Parthasarathi was also in very close, engagement with Shalikanatha. So in the Nyāya Ratnamala, a lot of the questions that he takes up are modeled after and in engagement with the questions that Shalikanatha takes up in the Prakarana Panchika. And we have Someshwara, who wrote a Nyāya Sudha, which is not the same Nyāya Sudha as the great Nyāya Sudha in the Dvaita tradition. But yeah, so he is commenting on the Shloka Vartika. So he's, on the Tantra Vartika. So he goes from 1-2 through the end of chapter 3. Both Parthasarathi and Someshwara become very important in later Mimamsa, again, because they're treating questions that are not just Shloka Vartika. They're not just interested in epistemology. They're interested in what we might call Mimamsa proper, which is how are we understanding sentences, how are we understanding sacrifice, right? And that's where they come in. Although Someshwara only comments on the section between 1-2 and 3-8, which is the section that Tantra Vartika goes to, he does draw in lots of some examples from the later parts of Mimamsa, especially from Tuptika territory, but especially also from the Uttara Shatka, which is sort of chapters 7 through 12. Good so far?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then what, to my mind, is the most fun period in Mimamsa, which is inaugurated in some ways by Apaya, but again, Apaya did not exist in a vacuum, right? So it's in some ways Vyasatirtha, who is I don't want to say nemesis, but the person against whom Apaya wants to define himself and whom Apaya is, Apaya has two great influences in his life, one of which is Vedānta Deshika, the other is Vyasatirtha, right? And Vyasatirtha in particular is somebody whom he's disagreeing with and he wants to refute, but he can't escape, right? Vyasatirtha is there. We have Madhusudana's Advaita Siddhi, of course, but we also have the Siddhanta Lesha Sangraha, which is also modeled after the way Vyasatirtha picks problems at the Advaita Vedanta system, right? So Apaya was a card-carrying Advaita Vedantin. And if you read his Vedanta works, whether it's his Advaita Vedanta works or his works in what is called Shiva Advaita, which is a different thing which we can also talk about if you're interested later in the questions. But if Apaya is talking, he's being a Mimamsaka, right? If Apaya is commenting on Vedanta, he is drawing examples not only from chapters 1 or chapters 1, 2 through 3, 8, not only from Tantra Vartika, but he's getting extensively into Tuptika territories, getting examples from 10, from 12, and so on and so forth. And He does all of that in his Vedanta works, but he writes one and possibly two Mimamsa works. There is a Shastra Deepika commentary that's attributed to an Appaya. We don't know if it's the same Appaya, because one, it could be a misattribution deliberately, or it could just be that Appaya, for example, had relatives that were also called Appaya, right? So it's confusing. But nobody really know. We aren't really sure if that Shastra Deepika commentary is his. But what is definitely his and utterly brilliant is this text called the Vidhi Rasayana, right? The elixir for injunctions, if you will. What's this really about? So vidhis, we said, are injunctions, right? Injunctions or commands. There are three kinds of vidhis, and this typology is already there in the sutras of Jaimini. And of course, Shabara talks about it. Kumarila defines them, right? What are the vidhis? The Apurva Vidhi, or a Vidhi that's completely new information. So the injunction, Vrihibhir yajeta, one should sacrifice with certain kinds of grains, right? New information, just straight up injunction. There are no other possibilities, right? Then we have what is called Parisankhya Vidhi. This is an injunction of exclusion. So the example for this is, there is a mantra that says, Imam agribhan rashana amritasya, right? You grasp this reign of immortality, and it says after that, iti ashwarashanam grinnati. You should grasp the rein for the horse. What is happening, right? The context is, there is a sacrifice in which there is both a horse and a donkey, and both of them have reins. I'm not making this stuff up, right? And you have this mantra that says that you should grasp the rein. Now, normally you would think if the mantra, that you have to recite the mantra, then you can do it when you're grasping both reins, right? That's the default. What the Veda does, what this sentence does, is that it precludes the possibility of grasping the rein of the donkey, right? The other kind of injunction is niyama vidhi, or an injunction of restriction. So the example for this is, you should pound rice with a mortar and pestle, right? Vrihin avahanti. Why is that a niyama vidhi? Well, you know from just being a person in the world, so you have to make these rice cakes in the sacrifice, right? From being a person in the world, you know that in order to cook rice, you first need to get the husks off. In general, you would think that there is a bunch of ways in which I can get the husks off, right? You could pick them up with your nails. I'm sure there are other ways of getting husks off rice that I don't know about. The nail example is in Mimamsa, that's why I know it. I have clearly never tried to get husks of rice. But you are being restricted to only one means, right? Which is to say pounding. So anyway, this is all background. What Appaya does in the Vidhi Rasayana is that he starts out by saying, well, Kumarila gave us these great definitions, and I'm going to clarify them a little bit. Okay? This is like a 120-page text. And in the first 2/3 or more of this text, he basically tells us all the different ways in which Kumarila's definitions of these injunctions are wrong, right? So, and the way he does it is interesting. This is why I was saying that Parthasarathi and Someshwara become relevant in this context, because he does it by citing, he reduces almost endless examples. I've been reading this text, and I've been reading it with Professor McRae, and we're about halfway through. And just the range and the complexity of analysis of the examples he cites from later chapters of Mimamsa is staggering. And what he says is, well, this one is supposed to be, say, a niyama vidhi. But if you apply Kumarila's definition precisely, then it becomes a parisankhya. And if you read his definition this other way, and he goes on like this, right? And then in the last tiny bit of the text, he says, well, if you read Kumarila this other way, which is really just a new set of definitions, if you really read Kumarila this other way, the definitions can work, right? So it's completely insincere in its defense of Kumarila, right? And again, McRae has talked a little bit about it in his work. There's not that much on it. The best thing really on the Vidhi Rasayana is in the introduction to Subramanya Shastri's edition of the Vidhi Rasayana. He has a beautiful Sanskrit introduction to it, and it's brilliant, right? Anyway, but Vidhi Rasayana does two things. One, it inaugurates, frankly, an industry of responses to Vidhi Rasayana. So nobody really buys Appaya's insincere claim that well, really, I'm only defending Kumar. Everyone knows that he's not, right? And people write lots of criticisms of Vidya Rasayana. Some of these criticisms are independent works, like the Vidya Rasayana Dushana of Shankara Bhatta, and some of them are what do you call it? They're embedded within larger texts. So, for example, Khandadeva in the Bhatta Deepika has a little response to the Vidya Rasayana. Other Mimamsakas also begin to include, well, this is why Appa is wrong, right? But the point is, he has a huge influence. And the other way in which he has an influence is he opens up the Mimamsa system, right? You can't go back to a pre-Appaya time when you just accept Mimamsa, the basic structure in toto. And the final thing that to my mind he does is he makes Mimamsa a system where these later examples, these later questions, the examples from later parts of the Mimamsa Sutras, again, drawing upon Parthasarathi and Someshwara, sometimes in the period following Appaya, people actually have complicated arguments about how Parthasarathi and Someshwara's understandings of certain things can be related to each other and so on and so forth. So he causes this turn towards one, later chapters in Mimamsa, and two, towards what I'm calling middle period Mimamsa, Parthasarathi and Someshwara. Appaya also knew Sucharita, I've recently discovered, right? We have, so Appaya is 16th century, we have Khandadeva in the 17th, and Khandadeva is, around this time we start to get the use of Navya even in the context of Mimamsakas, and really Khandadeva is the Navya Mimamsaka. He undoes some of the Siddhantas even of Mimamsa. So he writes the Bhatta Deepika, which is a commentary. It's almost intended as a textbook, right? And it is in fact used as a textbook. So Shastra Deepika and Bhatta Deepika are used as textbooks in the north and south. One is used in the north and the other is used in the south. I think, the Bhatta Deepika is more popular as a textbook in the south and the Shastra Deepika in the north. And he wrote this text called the Bhatta Tantra Rahasya, which engages with both Nabinyaya and grammar. We have the Prabhavali commentary of Shambhu Bhatta, which is brilliant not only in the way it elucidates Khandadeva, but because of the way in which it has this very close and very careful history of later Mimamsa. So everything, also of earlier Mimamsa for the record. So on any question that Khandadeva raises, Shambhu Bhatta will give you a whole history of it, beginning sometimes with the Bhashya and Vartika, sometimes with he will on pertinent questions get into Mandana, he'll get into Prabhakar and Someshwara, into Parthasarathi and Someshwara, but also just later Mimamsakas, right? What does Anantadeva say on this? What does this? So these 16th, 17th, 18th century Mimamsakas, really Shambhu Bhatta is your best guide to them, right? If you need a history of Mimamsa, of a question on Mimamsa, go to Shambhu Bhatta, right? Just brush up on your Sanskrit. But he's a great writer, right? And then special mention, Bhaskara Rai, this 18th century Mimamsaka, he wrote a commentary on Khandadeva called the Bhatta Chandrodaya. Really, they're just examples. Khandadeva and Appaya are sort of really transformative influences. Shambhu Bhatta is very important. Bhaskara Rai is interesting, but he's not important in the sense, he's important and significant, but we don't really know what his influence was because he's so late. He's already in the 18th century. We don't know how his influence played out. But Bhaskara Rai wrote these two major Mimamsa works, the Mimamsa Vada Kautuhala, which is co-authored with a friend of his teacher's son, Swami Shastri, and it deals with one of the questions that Khandadeva has raised. So it's an issue on which Khandadeva has said that old Mimamsa is wrong, and Swami Shastri and Bhaskara Rai argue this out in a 600-page manuscript. It's brilliant. It's great fun, right? And he wrote a sub-commentary on Khandadeva's Bhatta Deepika. Another interesting thing about Mimamsa is that up to Kumarila's generation, we have reason to believe that Mimamsakas really were atheists, right? But from Prabhakara onwards, definitely, Mimamsa as a system is atheistic. They don't believe in God with capital G or in deities to whom we offer sacrifice. Gods with a small g are only components of a sacrifice. They're a way to achieve the sacrifice. That's it, right? But they're also in other parts of their lives, people like Parthasarathy and everyone after really, they're also theists and in some cases actually bhaktas, right? This is something that, again, I cited Venkatrishnan before. This is something also that Venkatrishnan gets into. What it does, how they negotiate this, and so on and so forth. So for many generations, even Appaya, for example, right? We know that Appaya he's an Advaita Vedantin, he's a Shiva Bhakta. But when he's writing the Vidhirasayana, he just doesn't. I mean, of course, in something like the Vidhirasayana, the question of God doesn't come up at all because he's just talking about injunctions. In the opening verses, he does talk about, he does invoke gods. But for other people, especially those who are commenting on 1-1, which is Mimamsa's great statement of atheism, and where Kumarila talks extensively rejects the possibility of God. If you're commenting on that and you're also a card-carrying theist, either you just keep the two completely separate, or as some people in the 17th century began to do, you make the argument, but you also say that, well, this is really bad, and now I'm going to go do some namajapa to get this sin off me of saying that there's no God, right? Is that good so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Can we move to questions? I think I'm mostly done now. Yeah? Okay. I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah. Questions, comments?
So there were from Prabhakara there were atheists up until.
Well, I think Jaimini and Shabara are also atheists. I think Mimamsa as a system is atheistic. Personally, I think in terms of their personal practice, everyone up to Kumarila and Prabhakar, I think, was atheistic. Kumarila definitely was an atheist. We don't know very much about some of these intervening generations. Parthasarathy we know wasn't, because he actually has a Mangala verse. He has an opening invocatory verse to, I think, Narayan or something. Alexander Yuskokov has written about this a little bit, but yeah. So basically, second millennium Mimamsakas were typically believers in God in their personal life, even if they weren't when they were writing as Mimamsakas.
Regarding something that he asked in the starting about pratyaksha, you said we can have a pratyaksha in present or have it in the past.
No, just to clarify, and thank you for what I meant was you can have a pratyaksha can pertain to a present object, or at some point you could have had a pratyaksha of a past object, right?
Well,
that's not a pratyaksha about a past object. I'm saying there could have been a past pratyaksha, or there can be a present pratyaksha, right? Pratyaksha can only pertain to a present object. It can never pertain to either a past or a future object.
Yes, but we could say the same thing about like having pratyaksha in the future. Yeah, right. Where we could go, like in the future, you could have pratyaksha on any particular object.
Sure, but if you can't use the possibility of having a pratyaksha in the future as pramana.
Okay.
Right? I can't say that I will see heaven and so you should believe in it. Right? Right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So
call me Tarinee. I have a perfectly serviceable name.
okay, did you find any limitations in Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā?
Could you be a little louder?
Did you found any limitations in Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā? Limitations?
What kind of limitations do you mean?
Actually, as I observed, I don't know about Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā. So you were talking about sacrifices.
Can you do me a favor and move up front?
A bit closer.
There's somehow the angle is funny because I can hear them fine, but I can't hear you that well.
Yeah, the mic is. Yeah. Or you can just
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Move in.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I can see you and hear you.
So you were telling me about sacrifices, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's an example of curd to be sacrificed for heaven. So is there no role for adhikari? Like who does that? Is anybody can do that? Or
absolutely not. Sorry, we didn't talk about adhikara because I assumed it. I apologize. Mimamsa is really only by for twice born men.
Oh, okay.
Nobody else matters. Now the question is, if again, you could ask the question for Kumarila, right? That if you're saying that you want something, so you should be able to sacrifice, right? So you want something, and that's why you sacrifice. Well, anybody can want something, and they say no, no, no. But so this is how it works. If you could move to a place where I can see you, I would have a much easier time talking to you.
Like, please have a seat here.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, excellent. Now this is a problem, right? So this is how they do it. You need swadhyaya, right? You need upanayana in order to do swadhyaya, and in order to be eligible for Vedic study, and you need Vedic study in order to be eligible to do sacrifice, right? Now, the Veda tells you should do the upanayana for a Brahmana boy at this time. You should do it for a Kshatriya boy. You should do it for a Vaishya boy at this time. For nobody else does the Veda tell you when or how to do the upanayana. One. Two, again, in order to do sacrifice, you need to have done swadhyaya, come back home, gotten married, and established your fires, right? You're meant to have sacred fires in your house. And again, there is only injunctions for how and when to do it for Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and who are also twice born. And so nobody else. So because for eligibility, you need not only desire but also capacity, right? And capacity includes having done Vedic study and having your own fires. And nobody but twice born men have it. So it's all about twice born men. Kumarila, by the way, would hate everything about me. Because, but Kumarila hated almost everyone, so it's fine. Good. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Other thoughts?
You said it's very interesting that you said that Shavara never spoke about liberation.
No.
And yet, all of Mimamsa is about twice born men. Isn't twice born men about men who? Can you just explain what twice born men is?
Oh, twice born men is people who've gone through Yajñopavita or Upanayana Samskara.
Oh, okay.
Receive the sacred thread. How did you think it's related with liberation?
It's very interesting because I was in I was in an ashram in Rishikesh, and they told me like once you go through this whole process, you're like twice born. And it's sort of like as you do the practice, what the things you achieve, like once you get moksha, you'll be born again as a second person. So I was sort of connecting it to.
Well, I mean, to be fair, liberation is also about getting out of rebirth, right?
Yeah.
Liberation is precisely from marana, but also janma, right?
Yeah,
But so the idea of twice born is used very widely in non-Vedic contexts, in Tantra and so on, for the second birth that you get through Diksha. Right? Non-Vedic Diksha. Vedic Diksha is a whole other thing. But here, when we say twice born men in Mimamsa or Dharma Shastra context, we mean, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya men who've gone through their Upanayana Samskara. Right?
Okay.
G.
Yeah, I just want to ask a few questions. First, I will go. What is the purpose of Veda other than performing sacrifice according to Mimamsakas?
So for sorry, I cut you off.
So because normally the ultimate purpose, in my knowledge, ultimate purpose of doing sacrifice yaga, it generates that apurva for Swarga. So if that other than Swarga, are they believing any metaphysical world? So otherwise, only one ultimate goal is Swarga. So I just want to clarify.
So in Shabara, like I said, Swarga is the ultimate thing. You can have lesser goals like cattle, progeny, realm. You can get a village out of things, grama kama. But the ultimate thing is Swarga. Kumarila is a little bit more complicated. And John Tabor and Larry McCrea and the name is slipping me. But there has been work on whether Kumarila consistently believed that Swarga is the only or the ultimate thing to be achieved. There are parts of his work where Kumarila says that so there's a quotation, there's a very popular quotation from the Brihat Tika, which is lost, that performing your so there are three kinds of sacrificial offerings that you can do. There is Nitya, Naimittika, and Kamya. There are sacrifices like the Agnihotra that you have to do. There are Naimittikas, like if you have a son, you should do this, and there are Kamya sacrifices. If you want, I don't know, if you want a village, you should do this, right? Now it says Nitya Naimitikaireva Kurvano Dhritakshaya. So, but what one position that we find in Kumarila sometimes is that if you do just your Nitya Naimittika sacrifices, you don't do any Kamya or elective sacrifices, then all that you do is that you cut off your Pratyavaya, your existing bad karma, whatever you want to call it. Bad karma is such a misnomer, but like your bad merit, your demerits, you cut them off, and you come to a point of neutrality, right? And that is freedom from the cycle of rebirth. But it's not something that is posited as a higher goal than Swarga, right? It's for Kumarila also, it's really all about Swarga. So in the Mimamsa system, there is no metaphysical one that for a long time, like in Shabara and so on, there is no mention of liberation. And when there is no, at least in classical Mimamsa, there's no necessary um, priority given to liberation. We're really in it for the Swarga. Sorry.
So, and another one. So I'm a Vedantic. So I'm asking the question in perspective of that Vedantic. First of all, so means so I read about in Nyāya the work of Vyasatirtha, and also the Chandrika, the work of Vyasatirtha. He gave some lot of example to understand some Vedantic things. He gave lot of Mimamsaka examples
Yes,
to
yes.
understand Vedantic text. So there are a lot of the, for example, Apacheda Nyāya Vaishamya. So
Yes.
these are all so complicated. So when that Ejamana is supposed to perform the yaga, if there is big mistake has happened there, he's supposed to give Sarvasvadana. He's supposed to give every wealth of him to sacrifice because he did a wrong. So then he have to complete that yaga, and then he does another the same twice second time the same yaga, and he has to give everything what he has everything he has to give. So this if that in Vedantic, if some in Vedantic perspective, if there any mistake has happened, so they can they will believe in Krishna or what something. So they will say Krishna Arpana, what kayena vacha manasendreva. They will so whatever it is, I'm a doshi. So whatever my dosha it is, please forgive that. We have one Ishvara to forgive. So most of the Mimamsakas, I think it's an Irishwaras. So how this much of what I'm trying to say is Ishvara and Irishwara. One person is there to forgive what we did. So we don't have to do the same thing because of what we done in the past. So how difficult is being Mimamsakas in performing the yaga and all?
Well, there is a reason why the Vaishnava Vedantins won, right? In various kinds of, like, Vallabha, for example, says this categorically. He says, well, listen, this is the Kali age, right? You can't get it right. You will never be able to do it. Much better to just put your mind in Krishna. There's a reason why that world wins. As to how difficult it is to be Mimamsaka, well, for me it's impossible because I'm a woman. So I mean, I can be a Mimamsaka in the sense of I can study sentences, but I can't be a Yajnika in the Mimamsa system, right? Most people in the world can't. And then you have to have your fires, and it's a whole thing. So yeah, I mean, if your question is, if can you be a Yajnika, can you be a Triagnika in present times? I would not recommend it. But it's interesting that you bring up Vyasatirtha, because like I was saying before, in many ways it's Vyasatirtha who inspires Appaya's extensive engagement with lots of Mimamsa, but also there's an older history, right? So within Advaita Vedanta, Vachaspati, when he's commenting on again, in Vedanta as well, people who are dealing with the entire system versus just the Satyachatusutri tend to go a lot into Mimamsa examples. So Vachaspati does this. This guy Amanananda, who's probably somewhere between Vyasatirtha and Appaya, but I could be getting the date wrong. He does a lot of Mimamsa. So I think Vyasatirtha is an important figure in the later history of Mimamsa as well. Yeah.
Then another one. So Apurva thing. So
Yes.
what is Apurva exactly? Apurva it is a merit or a newest thing in the sentence Apurva. It is what you said. The carrying the.
So those are two different. So Apurva and Apurva Vidhi, and Apurva as the intermediary that gets you to heaven or whatever the result of the sacrifices are completely different things. Apurva Vidhi just means there's new information. Apurva in the context of sacrifice means this is a new thing that is being brought into being by the sacrifice through which you get the result of the sacrifice.
So for example, Jyotish Tomene Swarga Kama Yejeta.
Yes.
After he completes that Swarga Kama, he is not going to attain the Swarga the moment when he finished that yaga.
Exactly.
So Apurva it is carrying in between. This Apurva
Yes.
carrying into Swarga. Okay.
Exactly.
He did something bad thing in his in the same life after he completed that Swarga Kama. That bad thing destroyed the Apurvas which generate that
Pratyavaya.
Apurva.
So there's not a, I mean, this is a good question. There isn't a very clear answer. I think Shankara gets into it in the Taittiriya Bhashya a little bit. But I think they don't see it as cancelling each other out normally. Normally, they see this as both of these kind of just go on parallelly. Now, of course, the idea, if you think that Kumarila meant that by Nitya and Naimitikas, you just destroy your Durita, it's a little bit messy. It's not very clear what they mean. The other thing is also, Mimamsa as a system doesn't need rebirth. It can admit rebirth, but rebirth is not essential to the system. But yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's necessarily a very clear answer about. I don't think there is a consistent position that's been clearly articulated on whether bad deeds cut off the merits of a good deed, or they just independently also like it's not very clear to me if there's a consistent position on whether the swarga produced by Jyotishtoma can be countered by the pratyavaya that's produced by killing a brahmana. I don't know if there's a good answer.
Thank you.
Also, pertaining to the second question that Mr. Vishnu asked is, you were talking about how. Can you please repeat
Which one?
the second one about how
Apurva.
the one before that?
The bad.
Bad can.
Yeah.
Can you just which part is? I can.
Yeah, I sort of forgot about. Okay, we'll get back to that. But what I was going to ask you separately from that is, what is the conception of swarga in Mimamsa?
Priti swarga.
Tasty
Swarga is that which is pleasurable. That's it. They
That
don't say
which is-
anything else. Pleasurable.
Oh, okay.
That's it. There's no great image of what it's like. There's no discussion of what kind of a body you have, and nothing. Just pleasure.
Oh, I remember the question, which is, so if all of Mimamsaka is atheistic and there's no God forgiving, then if you do a demerit, essentially you get it away through sacrifice. Is that how it works?
Again, like I said, it's not entirely clear to me if you can get the demerit away through sacrifice, or you have to suffer the demerit and also get the merit from the sacrifice. I don't know if there's a consistent position.
I see. Okay.
Also, I will point out, I said all of Mimamsa is atheistic, which is to say, but it's complicated in that we have somebody called Deshika who's writing a text called the Seshvara-Mīmāṃsā, right? Where he's really deliberately recasting Mimamsa in order to make it theist. But again, that's Mimamsakas don't really consider that a Mimamsa text. It's like, just saying. Not, Anyway, moving on. Yeah, tell me.
Like so many questions. Stop me, time and everything. But regarding sacrifices, are there like material like gains that you can achieve?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, you can get cattle or villages or progeny or animals.
Okay.
Or like
And-
even stuff like Brahmavarchas, you can read all kinds of things.
And these are like deeply described in the sutras, and we can actually do them and they still work.
Well, if you the Mimamsaka answer to why a sacrifice didn't work is you must have done something wrong.
Okay.
Which, I mean, it's not like it's not it's impossible to disprove, right? I'm sure anybody doing a sacrifice gets something wrong. So if it works, see it works. And if it doesn't work, you must have done something wrong. There is I can't remember who has this. Somebody writes in the beginning of their work when they're introducing their family, they say, this father or this ancestor of mine, they did this sacrifice for Gramakama. This is why Gramakama is always in my head. They did produce this sacrifice for villages, and they got a village.
They got a village.
They got it. I mean, they must have gotten like a land grant or something, presume. I have no idea how these things work. But yeah, if you're not getting the result, you must have done something wrong.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Ma'am, can you discuss on the other pramana, that is Anupalabdhi?
I mean, I'm not an expert in Anupalabdhi. I can point you to resources, but the reason I said it's complicated is because it's sometimes included within Pratyaksha, and I think Kumarila takes it as a separate pramana. I can point you to things on it. I'm not an expert. I only know the bare bones.
What does it even do?
So Anupalabdhi is non-grasping, right?
Oh.
So the question is whether it is to be taken as an independent pramana or not, which Kumarila I think does.
Are there any contemporary Mimamsaka players that are still in the game?
Contemporary Mimamsa scholars or contemporary Trayagnikas? Again, again, Mimamsakas draw this distinction between the Yajnika view, right? So the Yajnikas, the practitioners, need not all be Mimamsakas, right?
Okay.
But until a couple of centuries ago, all Mimamsakas were typically Yajnikas of some kind. I am really not a thing that existed 2 centuries ago. But sorry, your question was about whether there are contemporary Yajnikas or Mimamsakas. Oh, there are.
And
To both, yes. There are Yajnikas who are not Mimamsakas. There are Yajnikas who, even now, there are Yajnikas who are Mimamsakas. And there are sort of scholars of Mimamsa or students of Mimamsa like me who don't really subscribe to the system, but we enjoy studying it.
and where are they concentrated really?
So in India, Yajnikas you'll find a lot in Maharashtra. You'll find a lot in peninsular India generally. If you really look, you might find a few in Banaras, but not that many. In terms of scholars of Mimamsa, if you're looking at traditional scholars, there are again lots in Maharashtra, some in Tamil Nadu. There is, for example, Mani Dravid Shastrigal, who is, I think, Professor Acharya is very familiar with, who's a Mimamsaka. So yeah, there are,
Do you perceive Mimamsakas injunction as deontological?
Well, it's complicated, and Elisa Freschi has written about it, and I can point you to that. Okay? And Patrick Cummins has also written about it. I can point you to works. Good?
No, I wanted your thought on how do you perceive their idea of
How I perceive. I mean, I'm a Bhatta, insofar as I'm a Mimamsaka. So, I mean, I think for Bhatta Mimamsa, I don't think they're deontological, if that helps. Prabhakaras are different.
And also, it would be historically important for the people. So, speak about the influence of Bhatta system over Shankara and Prabhakara system over Vishittadvaita.
Right. So, yeah, so the influences, like you point out, played out differently. Again, I'm not necessarily the right person to work out the details of the influence, but But broadly, like I said at the beginning, there is this difference between Vyavahare Bhattanaya and Vyavahare Gurunaya. So for Shankarites, typically, if they're even mentioning Mimamsa, chances are they're reaching into Bhatta-Mīmāṃsā. Shankara himself is very much in the wake of Kumarila. Sri Vaishnavas and I think Madhvas tend to be Vyavahare Gurunaya. It's quite interesting. One of the commentators on Parthasarathi is he appears to be a Vaishnava Vedantin of some kind. And he says that I am basically a Prabhakara, but I really like Parthasarathi and I'm going to comment on his work. And it almost seems like he's obligated to be a Prabhakara. And I'm not sure what that obligation like why is it? I mean, either it's sectarian that if you belong to a certain lineage, you're more likely to be, or you're expected to be a Prabhakara. But yeah, I'm not an expert in exactly how the nitty-gritty of this plays out in Vedanta. But thank you, that's a great question. I should know more about it. Other thoughts?
Is Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā? Okay, so when I was told to read Indian philosophy by Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, and as I was reading and I got to Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā, I just felt like it was just like an outdated version of Vedanta, and yeah, it's almost like they were clinging on to certain ideas. Is that a right way to think about Mimamsa?
I mean, when you say they're clinging on, what does that mean?
I think again, like you said, it was about like to shun the Buddhists and anyone else who sort of like follows Smriti, and it was more about and to make sure that Veda stands by its and it was
Okay,
more.
so imagine for 1 second, right, that you're in any century before the 15th, okay, and you have no reason to believe that the world is not eternal, right? It's not crazy to want to say that if you want something, if you want pramana for something in the future, you need something other than perception and perception-based pramanas. And that if I can establish the validity, the fact that a text is authorless and eternal, I can say that it's more likely to be valid than authored and non-eternal texts. Right? It's not a crazy idea. Right? So it's not, I mean, I said that a lot of these arguments are framed in terms of the Buddhists and so on and so forth. But I think a great disservice has been done to Mimamsa in the way it is presented in some of these introductory texts, right? Which is that it is done entirely in terms of, well, this is what they thought about pramana, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So one is this, right? That in that world, it's not that much clinging on, right? One. Two, theoretically, if you can present the Mimamsaka with, theoretically, I'm not saying that any actual Mimamsaka would be like this, but if they're committed to the epistemology of their system, presented with evidence that the Veda is not eternal, they ought to be able to reorient themselves, right? Because they only care about, theoretically, structurally, they have, obviously, in practice, there are social reason and community related reasons and so on why they care. But theoretically, they care about the Veda because it's the best means to Svarga, right? And it's the best means to Svarga because it's eternal and authorless. If you can give them proof that it is, if you can give them archaeological, I don't know, right, that the world was created, they would have to reorient, right? That's one part. The other part is, like I said, much of Mimamsa is actually about how you read, right? And you see that seep into traditions that are not Mimamsakas, that are antithetical. So, for example, this, I talked about Vidhi Anumeya, right? You see Dharmottara use it, right? You see reading practices from Mimamsa across systems. Mimamsa is almost a lingua franca of Sanskrit Shastra. The other thing is that Mimamsa becomes a prestige discipline, right? Especially in the second millennium. But even for somebody like Shankara, right? Shankara had this Gaudapadan metaphysics, right? There were existing Brahmasutra commentaries. He wanted to make Gaudapadan metaphysics properly Mimamsaka, right? That's how you got taken seriously in academic circles. So it was a prestige discipline then as it is now. It's like, why does anybody learn Greek, right? Again, in the second millennium, you see more and more of this. Somebody like Appaya is talking about a question that nobody has disputed in like 800 years. Nobody has had a problem. It's not like Kumarila's definitions of Vidhi typology is a hot topic in Mimamsa. It's not. I can't tell you how much it is not, right? But he goes and he writes this massive, brilliant, involved text which would have taken ridiculous amounts of time to produce and effort. Why is he doing it? It's because he can, right? I have command over this super difficult discipline, right? So it's if you look at later Mimamsa, the question of God and the question of Veda Pramanya aside, it's a fascinating way of analyzing how you classify things, how you read sentences, how sentences work. And then the other side of this is, sure, but if you think about the people in the second millennium who are establishing the validity of other kinds of texts, if you look at somebody like Yamuna, they're not quote unquote card carrying Mimamsakas, but they are using Mimamsa, right? So on the one hand, Mimamsa itself as a discipline is doing interesting things. On the other hand, Mimamsa principles are being employed in novel ways in other worlds, right? Does that at all?
Yeah.
Mimamsa is fun.
Okay.
If you take nothing away from these 2 hours, take away that Mimamsa is fun. Other thoughts?
What would be your suggestion for the beginners in Mimamsa for students to start with reading Mimamsa?
In primary texts or secondary material?
Primary or primers?
So the common answer is Lavakshi, Bhaskara, Jaimini, and Ayamala, but I'm not going to give that answer. I'm going to say get into Shabara. Shabara it's not a hard read, right? Just pick up, interesting bits, read 1:1, it's short. Maybe get into 1:2 a little bit. Maybe read just the first chapter in toto, the first couple of Adhikaranas of chapter 2. And then see where you want to go, right? Chapter 9 has all that stuff about Devatas, which might be interesting to some of you. But yeah, I mean, I would say get into Shabara straight up, then think about getting into Tantra Vartik and so on. I say this because a lot of these primers incorporate a lot of later developments and a lot of later debates, right? Whereas, really, to get a sense of how Mimamsa works, it's a good idea to just start with Shabara. In terms of secondary material, I've already said Maitreya's and all its works are good. Jha has translated practically everything, so that's nice. But yeah, does that at all? Good.
Thank you. That was so beautiful.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun. This was a great morning.
We're doing a word of thanks.
Oh, okay. I think I've been thanked enough. But if you want to thank me again, sure. But it's okay, really.
I think it's something we have to do for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ma'am, the session was very great. It's really interesting and insightful to everyone, especially to the philosophy students and research scholars. Thank you, ma'am, for your scholarly lecture.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
I thank Srinivas sir and Department of Philosophy, and I thank Vishnu sir and your ma'am, and I thank one and all.
Thank you.
Thank you. By this way, I wind up this session. Thank you.